I wanted to start off and just ask you a question. What is a kid from Shreveport, Louisiana, living in Europe, being recognized around the world for his intellectual property? How did that happen?
Well, let's see. How long do we have, Brian?
Time,
I don't. I've always been fascinated by things that were cultural, things that were that had to do with forms. That had to do, in retrospect. Let me back up a little bit. In retrospect, as I look back through my life, all the different things I got involved in and got interested in, they all had to do with tapping into something that we can't see, but that I intuitively knew affected everything we did and everything we noticed. Something individual. You could call it whatever you want. Spirit, your soul, the God, universal energy, whatever you call it. There's something, I had a sense that there was something bigger. My first job was a magician at age 5. Charged 5 cents for a magic show I did on the sidewalk in Palestine, Texas, where I lived my first 6 years. And so, why was I interested in magic? Well, magic is about stuff you can't see, and it makes things happen. So I kind of always been interested in stuff like that. And I thought I also had the ability to actually studied acting. My mom gave me acting classes when I was 11. And because I used to come out and do comedy shticks for the family and so forth. And so she said, well, maybe be something that to support there. So we actually had in Shreveport at Centenary College a very sophisticated, actually, community theater. Semi-professional. In the summer, they would bring in pros from New York and San Francisco and other places to do the leads. And it turns out that I got my first role as playing Lewis in The King and I. So I learned to sing Whistle a Happy Tune and did that. And I fell in love with the theater, fell in love with just being in that kind of environment. So that gave me a taste of, and I met people from New York. I met people from sort of outside the South and outside of Shreveport, which was interesting to begin with. I also had a half sister. She was my dad's daughter, who was quite a bit older than me, who had wound up marrying many considered him the intellectual chronicler of the Beat generation, a man named John Cleland Holmes. And John and Shirley, my sister, were good friends with Kerouac and Ginsberg and all of those people, of that generation, of the Beat scene itself. And they lived in Connecticut. John was a writer. And I actually got a chance to visit them. My dad died when I was 9. And so my mom took me on a trip to visit my sister in Connecticut. I'd never been there before. But then I got to meet, now you would say, the hippest of the hip in terms of artists and writers and intellectuals that would be visiting with them. So I got to spend 2 or 3 weeks in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And John Cleland Holmes, his great-grandfather was Oliver Wendell Holmes. So I was starting to be introduced to all of that. But then in high school, I turned out I was a good debater, so we won a bunch of championships there. But there'd been an exchange student in our high school who was from Germany with the American Field Service. AFS was an exchange program. And at the time, there were not many Americans that went for a year. Americans would usually go for the summer because there weren't that many families around the world that would be willing to, support and take on an American kid. But I went ahead and applied, and it turns out I got it. So that year there were only 300 of us from the States, and we could have gone anywhere through the American Field Service. Whatever family they tried to match up with, where would I go? So I wound up going to Zurich, Switzerland, lived with a Swiss family for a year, learned to speak a little bit of Swiss German, and got a chance to see a whole new side of culture. I went to Real Gymnasium Zurich, where, a block from the Kunsthaus in Zurich, and I would go down and I'd have a beer in the Odeon Cafe, which is where Dadaism started, and it's where Jung, wrote, and then go to the Kunsthaus and see Monet's Water Lily. So, I guess fairly young, sort of surprisingly, I was able to kind of step out of the cocoon then of what one would think of, in a sort of conservative Southern culture.
Right.
And then I decided to go to a crazy little college. I didn't know what I wanted to do kind of when I grew up, but I came back from Switzerland with an interest in, I had thought maybe I would want to go into law because, again, that's sort of this sort of etheric sort of thing. And I came back actually after being in Switzerland with a very big interest in sort of cultural stuff. So philosophy and art and so forth was something that turned me on. My brother had gone, he was 4 years older than me, had gone to a New England, upper university and flunked out because he went into math and science, but he was really a jazz musician. And, and I didn't want to go to a big university, maybe have the experience he did. So it turns out I got recruited to go to a crazy little college that was set up in Florida, in Sarasota, Florida. And I was in the second graduating class of this little college, and this little college was called New College, as in New College, Oxford, but New College of Sarasota, Florida. And it was actually a lot of really interested cultural supporters and education supporters with a good bit of money funded this college set up. No grades, design your own education. Sort of take yourself by your own bootstraps and then use a great faculty, small student body. The dormitories we lived in, no rules, but it was the only building in Florida designed by I.M. Pei. And, it was in the old Ringling Museum area. So I got a BA in 3 years, did a lot of independent study projects, hitchhiked across the Middle East as one of them in 1967. So by that time, I'd started to taste an awful lot of different kinds of things and different people from a lot of different cultures and different stuff. So I had a fairly wide range of stuff. And I got fascinated. I started out, I hope this is not getting too long for you.
This is great.
I started out interested in philosophy because I thought philosophers, and I tried to read Aristotle and Plato and then a lot of the newer philosophers. And I got a little bored because it seemed like the philosophers proved their original hypothesis with their original hypothesis. I don't know, that's kind of a circle, But what got fascinating, I had a great academic advisor who was also the history professor there. And he turned me on to history of thought, history of culture, history of thinking. I got very interested in why those philosophers started with that hypothesis. Why did Kant start with that? Why did Plato start with that? What was different about that? And then I got turned on, fascinating book to read, which really impacted me a lot, was Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, which was sort of an early, in the 20th century, early writing about, he was the first guy that sort of compared the Western civilization to the fall of Rome. That civilizations had their own life, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And he identified the multiple cultures around the world that had gone through these different lifestyles. Why did the Greeks not have a zero? Why did the idea of infinity only showed up in the Western civilization itself? So there were a lot of very interesting things about all that then affected, and also the college I went to focused people on a lot of sort of the cultural history. Why did the Baroque era, did the math, the science, the art, the architecture, the philosophy, the literature, all had similar themes inside of them? So I got fascinated by that. We didn't even use the word back then, paradigms, but really what I began to study or get fascinated by was cultural paradigms. The belief systems we have that we don't know we have that then are affecting everything we do, everything we express, everything we notice. So again, that was one of those, started to tweak this whole sense of that there's stuff we can't necessarily see, but that if you could get a hold of that, again, I'm probably the laziest guy you ever met. Certainly one of them.
I find that hard to believe.
Well, come on. If I could go boom and move that thing from there to there without having to physically do it, how efficient would that be? Right. So that the whole idea of being a magician, or like trying to find out how could I get in touch with whatever those things are, because if it is affecting all of us that much, if we could somehow get inside of that and understand the principles, so that would be really cool. Right. Then we might be able to do stuff or understand stuff or perceive stuff or have a more effective, fun experience in life. Anyway, those were, I don't know that I had those thoughts in that way back then, but in retrospect, if I look back on the track. So I wound up in intellectual history. And I got fascinated by the American culture. I did my bachelor's thesis on the decade of disenchantment, America in the 1920s. which was funny because I did that in 1967 and 68. And of course, you know what was going on in 67 and 68.
A lot of turmoil, a lot of mayhem.
And all the hippies and everybody else and everybody going, America sucks, and they were leaving the country and going to Paris and smoking dope and doing all kinds of things. Guess what? That was so American. That they were doing that in the 20s. It just wasn't quite the volume that they were doing in the 60s, but that's exactly what they did. That's exactly, and I was saying, these people think they're so unique. I said, it's not unique at all. As a matter of fact, it's quite American. So I got fascinated by all that. So I wound up in American intellectual history in graduate school. I got into Berkeley.